here's where I want to start to break away a little bit to Geshe Sopa's commentary on the Lam Rim Chenmo. Of course, the 12 links are discussed in the Lam Rim, so you can often find in Lam Rim texts nice explanations of these. And Geshe Sopa goes into a wonderful commentary on a lot of these. And when he's talking about feeling, I really like how he presents it, so that's why I'm going to share a little bit of this. Hopefully it won't take too long for me to read this. It says, let us look again at this whole process of the evolution of a human being, thinking of the being as an experiencer. All samsaric life is experience, and whatever you experience within a particular life is due to causes and conditions. Your physical form and your mental life are both the results of karmic seeds planted at an earlier time. The human as experiencer has these two parts, the physical and the mental. The physical aspect coalesces in the mother's womb with the union of the parental semen and egg, and the consciousness joins at the moment of conception. As we said earlier, with the completion of name and form, you have an actual body. At that stage of the fertilized ovum, enlivened with consciousness, you have obtained the entity of a body, although the details of its shape have not yet fully manifested. By the power of karma, the body with its faculties continues to develop, and at the stage of the 6 sense bases, the sense faculties come to their full manifestation. At that point, the entire physical instrument that enables the being to be an experiencer is complete. All the particular physical requirements and capacities to experience life, to be a subject who experiences an object, are in place. The faculty, which is the sense sphere, consciousness, and object are now linked together. Then comes contact, the point at which a faculty, consciousness, and object meet. This meeting creates experience as a consciousness grasping an object as attractive, unattractive, or neutral. In other words, from contact, feeling arises. In dependence on whether you come in contact with an object you determine to be attractive, unattractive, or neutral, you experience a feeling that is pleasant, suffering, or neutral. This is the way you experience life. Feeling is the experience of the ripening of your karmic seeds. Sometimes you have pleasant feelings, sometimes you have unpleasant feelings, sometimes they are kind of neutral. One feeling after another. This is the way you experience your life. Most of the effort of your life is directed at striving for pleasant feelings. I kind of like how he presents it in this context of being, this is how we experience life. This is how we become experiencers. And of course, everything ensues from that, as we're going to see when we look at the next links coming up. This kind of concludes the first outline. Remember I said Lama Tsongkhapa had 2 outlines in regard to presenting the 12 links, these verses that kind of set them out. If we go back to what those were, the first one was the causes and effects that propel one into life. These are what are often called the projecting causes and the projected results or effects. Then we have the next ones coming up, which again, what J. Garfield used in Ocean of Reasoning as the outline was that they were called the resultant causes and effects. In a lot of the other presentations, they're called the actualizing causes and the actualized effects. So in a sense, we have kind of the foreshadowing of all of this in the first 7 links, and then we have kind of what ensues on the basis of those in regard to the last 5 links. But nonetheless, it's not that linear. Again, we're talking about a process that's interactive and very dynamic in terms of how these links fit in with each other. But essentially now we're moving from that first part that's giving us kind of what sets up the scene, what causes there to be the potential to project one into another life. Now we're looking at what actually actualizes your taking another rebirth. And the 2 next factors are the 2 most important ones involved in getting that seed to ripen into a potentialized existence, having the ability to actually propel us into that life. It already had the potential to do that when we planted it on the consciousness back in links 2. We committed the act in 2, and it was imprinted on the consciousness in link 3, the first part. What makes it into the effect consciousness are the next 2 links, primarily. There are other factors involved, which I'll talk about in a moment, but we're now moving into the 8th link, which is craving, and then we'll go right into the 9th link of grasping, both of these being a form of attachment, this word that we use in Buddhism frequently. Sometimes the 8th link is even translated as simply attachment. So let's read verse 6, the first 2 lines, A, B. I'm sorry, I need to go to the next page. I didn't have it up here in my sheet, sorry. Conditioned by feeling is craving. One craves because of feeling. Okay, so this is the first link of craving. So that on the basis of having these feelings, we then have some level of craving or attachment. Now you might say, but attachment sounds like what I only have in relation to pleasant objects or pleasant feelings, right? That's how we normally present attachment. But we can say you have an attachment to continue to experience pleasant feelings, but you have an attachment also that doesn't want to experience the suffering feelings, the unpleasant feelings. An attachment, in other words, to not being with those. You can also have an attachment to kind of abiding within a neutral feeling. So if we look at our little chart here, for craving, it says craving or attachment refers to our desire to hold on to pleasure, to separate ourselves from pain. We can call that a form of attachment. And our desire for neutral feeling to not diminish. Although we feel attachment even in the womb, or craving even in the womb, the emphasis in the 12 links is on the specific acts of attachment that nourish the karmic potency, which again is the second link, that will produce the next lifetime, which will be fully actualized when we get to the 10th link, which is that moment when that karmic seed is now ready to take off, ready to propel us into that next life. So this craving is in particular what's arising as this life is ending. They say that there's always some level of attachment when we haven't tamed our minds. Again, for bodhisattvas who are dying, they might have great compassion in their minds that will be impelling them into another existence. For ordinary beings such as ourselves, we have this mind of attachment that is craving, grasping, wanting to continue to experience pleasant feelings of samsara or to avoid the unpleasant feelings that might be occurring at that time. So again, there was a lot more in terms of, maybe not that much more. No, I think I read everything for that. We now have, again, the first two lines of verse 6. This is the commentary Tsongkhapa gives on that. He says, thereafter, conditioned by feeling, craving arises, because to crave is to crave to be the subject of feelings. Why does one crave? The craver craves in order to experience feeling, because he or she is desirous of that. He or she craves that the pleasant in order to not be away from it. He or she craves being away from suffering, and he or she craves the non-diminution of the neutral. When there is craving, then we're moving into the last bit in terms of moving into grasping. So let's go ahead and read those next two lines in regard to grasping, the last two lines of verse 6. When one craves, there is grasping. The four kinds of grasping take place. Now, I found it interesting. They use the translation for that term for grasping. They use appropriation in J. Garfield's translation. So in that text, first says, when there is craving, conditioned by craving, these four objects of appropriation or grasping, which are the causes of the propelling karma, will be appropriated or grasped at. The first is desire, the sense objects. Again, this is the strongest one within. That we're always, because we're embodied beings and we've been together with sense objects throughout this life, there's always some craving of sense objects that can be present there. It's the most likely one that's at least taking some part as we approach the end of this life, and it becomes heavier in terms of this accentuated craving that becomes grasping. The second thing that is mentioned is views, in particular bad views, erroneous views, wrong views that we've held. The third is arrogance in one's own propriety and in one's own conduct, which is a particular view that holds one's own bad ethics and bad views as supreme. And then finally, the view of self-grasping, that self-grasping that is, for again, beings who are together with this ignorance, is going to be a component of what we are also grasping at. We're grasping at a self. We're grasping at an inherently existent I that we don't want to let go of, that we are, caught up in because we have that ignorance present. So when there are the four objects of appropriation, the existence of the appropriator of these four, that is, he who takes birth, arises, conditioned by the appropriation. So this moves us into the next two lines of, actually, let's wait and we'll go into that in a moment. So let me talk a little bit more about these two in terms of what Geshe Sopa shares in regard to craving. In particular, he says, Tsongkhapa points out that the statement, craving arises as a result of feeling, needs to be qualified. Feeling itself is not the ultimate cause of craving. Craving is caused when feeling is accompanied by ignorance. This is really important to understand. If you don't have that ignorance present, then you can have all the feelings in the world, all the pleasant, unpleasant, whatever is arising, and you're never going to have any problem with those feelings because you're not craving on the basis of this ignorance. All of our attachment, all of our craving, whether again it's any of these three, craving to not be separated from the pleasant, to be separated from the unpleasant, to have this continuance of the neutral, all of those are based on this strong adherence to this inherently existent I. Again, what we're going to refute in the next chapter, chapter 18. On the basis of that ignorance being there, it becomes problematic. We have this craving arising, and of course it gets heightened into grasping. He says here, in the 12 links, ignorance is the root cause that sets the whole process in motion. When a particular feeling arises, it is rooted in ignorance and dominated by ignorance. Therefore, when a feeling of pleasure or aversion arises toward an object, that object is being perceived in a distorted way. You know, we're perceiving a distorted way on the basis of a self that we're distorting in terms of how we're viewing the self. Because of ignorance, the feeling arises based on this mistaken perception. When that feeling is pleasurable, you desire the object and want to possess it. When the feeling is unpleasant, you desire separation from the object. In either case, the feeling gives rise to the craving only because it is dominated by ignorance. So again, this is this process that we are engaged in terms of objects. There is this connection then between the seventh and the eighth, and that the seventh becomes this platform by which we are able to, if we haven't tamed our minds, have this craving arise. The craving then gives rise to deepened grasping. Je Tsongkhapa in another paragraph, and this is a very short one, I'll just read this as well. He says, this nexus between the seventh, feeling, and the eighth, craving, links, provides a good illustration of how these 12 links operate as a chain of causation. A feeling is the culminating result of the previous set of causes, ignorance, karma, consciousness, and so on. And when that feeling arises, that particular sequence of cause and result is complete. But at the same time, that feeling is giving rise to a new craving, which may take the form of attachment, aversion, or some other affliction. That new craving will motivate new karma, and a whole new cause-result sequence will be set in motion by the completion of the last one. In this way, the chain of experience within one lifetime and the chain of lifetimes within cyclic existence perpetuate themselves. That self-perpetuating process is what the 12 links of dependent origination are really talking about. So we can see again that even in our discussion so far, we've really highlighted a couple of really key links. You know, the very first one, of course, the ignorance that is present, that we have to be targeting at some point in our spiritual practice to lessen the effect of that in our minds and eventually eliminate it, because it's what's propelling the whole process. But then, of course, the action link, on the basis of that ignorance, engaging in actions. And then, of course, what ensues from that in terms of the rebirths that we take, we are empowered to experience the world around us. And if we don't have a healthy way of experiencing the world around us, we're going to perpetuate the process more. So these two links of craving and grasping are really highlighting how we get unhealthily involved in the world around us when they're together with ignorance, when we have those experiences with the underlying ignorance present, we then have these unhealthy patterns of craving and grasping. So it's a really wonderful instruction in terms of giving us how to pick apart what's going on every moment of our lives, pretty much, and look at how we are kind of driven in this way. Makes you really, and the whole purpose of this type of study is to really develop a distaste for samsara, to get kind of fed up with it once and for all. To say, I'm tired of being under the control of all these factors. I can control them to some degree with some mindfulness and ability, but you're still going to be under the control of them in your next life, and your next life, and your next life, and your next life, just as you have been since beginningless time. You know, time to break free once and for all. To kind of get the message, you know, to have the penny drop, as Venerable Robina would say. So let's move on then to this next one that takes us from this grasping, this higher level of attachment, and moves us into the actual potency of that karmic seed that was the second link, becoming fully actualized in terms of the 10th link of becoming. So let's, for this, we're going to read verse 7, and then continue in verse 8 just through the first line. Where there is grasping, the becoming of the grasper thoroughly comes to be. Were there no grasping, then, being free, there would be no becoming. This becoming is also the five aggregates. So the idea here is that through the force of that strong grasping that occurs at the end of life in particular, when one seeks re-embodiment, doesn't want to sort of leave this existence behind. Now, they say there's even some subtle form of that, even if the body is emaciated, you don't really have any desire to stay with the body because it's so ravaged by illness or what have you. You would definitely still want embodiment. You're craving kind of to be embodied, grasping at all of that. So the idea here is that if you didn't have that grasping present, you'd be free. You wouldn't there would be no more becoming. But of course, to annihilate that grasping means you have to annihilate the first link. You can have a lessening of that grasping or other factors present, and I'll read you a passage again from Je Tsongkhapa. It'll be the last one probably I read tonight from that, but where he does talk about kind of how there's a third factor. Besides these two links of the 8th and 9th, craving and grasping, there's a third factor, a third karma, if you will, that we're creating at the time of death that is also an important component of all of this. So I'll talk about that in a moment, but the idea here is that this link, this particular link that we are referring to of existence or becoming, is that karmic seed that we planted in the second link, now made fully ripe. In the 12 links of dependent arising, it's pictured as a pregnant woman, so that it's ready to give birth. it's that moment just prior to your exiting this life and entering into your next existence through the intermediate state and what have you. So I don't know if I didn't even look at the description of grasping on the chart. I don't think I read that. Let me read that real quickly. Grasping is an increase of attachment and includes strong clinging to pleasant forms, sounds, odors, tastes, and touches, as well as to bad views and systems of behavior associated with those views. It is possible at any point in one's life to have attachment and grasping that serve to potentialize a karma from the past, but near the end of a lifetime, these two links are particularly influential in shaping the next lifetime. Becoming refers to a fully activated karmic potency. Again, it's that second link, ready to give rise to the next lifetime. It occurs during the last moment of the present lifetime. Sometimes this link is called existence. In that regard, we can say that it's a case of giving the name of the result to the cause. That is a karma. Remember, the second link and the 10th link are both karma action, whereas the first link, the 8th link, and the 9th link are all afflictions, and all of the other links are resultant suffering that we have, resultant states from those. So there's a link or these are exactly the same thing. The action that was imprinted on the consciousness, the action that was the second link that was imprinted on the consciousness, the third part of the beginning of the third link, that is fully potentialized and becomes that 10th link, which is that karma ready to give birth to our next rebirth by the force of those factors that we just discussed. So it then is the effect consciousness. It's the third link at that last moment, just before the next rebirth is caused, or is activated. So, okay, let's look at what Je Tsongkhapa says on this, because again, I do think it's really important as we're studying these to hear from these great masters who've expounded upon, how to use this knowledge of the 12 links. That seed remains dormant until it is nourished and activated by the moisture of the afflictions of craving and grasping, the 8th and 9th links. Again, that seed that was the second link. The projecting karmic seed is thereby reactivated and ready to yield its fruit as a new rebirth. However, there is one more causal element necessary to complete the causes of this period of actualization, and that is a secondary karma, an action taken just at the time of death. In other words, there are 3 supportive causes that actualize the main karmic seed. Craving and grasping are the afflictions that act as the moisture, awakening and activating the seed. And then a final karma, which is usually a mental action, a thought at the time of death, acts as the 3rd supportive cause. This final karma will be similar in its ethical tone, virtuous or non-virtuous, to the main karmic seed. So you influence that karmic seed that is coming forward and being nourished by the thoughts you have at the time of death. This is the whole point of all of this, is that, another way to look at this third factor that Geshe Sopa is presenting is that this is what we have, hopefully, somewhat within our control. Because the degree to which we become familiar with more virtuous thoughts throughout this life is a degree to which we will have that to draw upon at the time of death. Without having become familiar with virtue, there's not much hope for us, because we'll get to the end of this life and we'll still have our crazed mind of attachment and jealousy and whatever else, all the other afflictions arising. We won't have much room for something positive that could have a guiding influence in terms of our next rebirth. Even if you've created a lot of virtue in this life, through various acts of generosity and that, but you're not still that familiar with thoughts of compassion, loving kindness, what have you, bodhicitta. These are all important thoughts for us to cultivate. So he says, in this way, I skipped a little part of it. It says, in this way, the thoughts of a person who is approaching death act as an essential condition that nurtures and activates the main projecting karmic seed. This is why it is important to guide the mind of a dying person to the side of virtue as he or she approaches death. But again, our luck in that might be very indeterminate, because if the person themselves are not that familiar with it, if they're dying with this angry mind they've had their whole lifetime, good luck in steering them to some sort of virtuous thought. But again, this is mostly, though we can take it as instruction here for others who are dying, mostly an instruction for ourselves. What are we doing with our lives so that we become so familiar with all these delusions, if they're going to be what arises at the time of death, not virtuous thoughts, positive thoughts. Won't be, unless we're familiar with all these things, we won't be practicing Tonglen on our deathbed. Those are not going to be thoughts that arise that naturally. This again emphasizes the importance of practice in this life. We can't yet get rid of that first link. That's what the aim of this course is, of course, to get rid of the first link. But while we are still in this process and not free of that first link, use the knowledge of this to your advantage. Use the knowledge that there is this third factor, the mind at the time of death, that will help induce a good rebirth at least. So that then the two links that follow, birth and aging and death, will actually be in a good existence. An existence like this one, where we can use it meaningfully, purposefully. So I could easily go through the last two links because there's not really too much there, but let me first check in and see if there are any questions, because I want to make sure I allow time for that tonight. It's about 8:05, 8:06, somewhere in there, 8:07 maybe. Any questions? And I don't know if there are questions from folks who are online too. You can use the chat box for that if you do want to ask a question. Again, I'm sure many of you in the room have heard teachings on the 12 links, so I'm not teaching you anything new per se in terms of content, but hopefully giving some context for why it's important to study this, why His Holiness always begins with this as his way of examining this whole topic. Because if we don't get this, this is what we're involved in. This is our life. We're on that wheel of life that is depicted, and we have to get off of it already. We should be dizzy by now from having gone round and round and round. So I used to hate merry-go-rounds. They kind of make me ill. So if I think about the wheel of life that we've been on in that way, I should be really, really ill. No, I don't have that quote, or maybe I do have that quote with me. There's a wonderful quote I've shared before in the context, so I didn't bring it with me. Shoot. From Je Tsongkhapa Tenzin Palmo, who says that most of us don't really have a desire to leave samsara. We just want to make it a little bit nicer. She says it's like we want to paint the cell of our prison a prettier color, and that is the way we have to look at it, is what are we doing with our lives? Are we just trying to paint over, gloss over what is really suffering, what is really dukkha, unsatisfactory, and make it seem like it's not so bad? I mean, this is what we're doing with most of our lives. Again, I'm talking mostly to myself here, obviously, but I think we're all engaged in that process of just kind of glossing it all over, thinking, it's really not that bad. We should be just like wanting to be out of here, absolutely out of here. That's what the mind of renunciation is. That's what precedes one's generation of the wisdom of emptiness, to be able to be free from one's own suffering and attain individual liberation. When we unite it with bodhicitta, then we want to go beyond just that individual liberation and attain Buddhahood, because we see everyone else is on this same wheel, is continuing to suffer. We want to be most skillful in helping all of them. No questions? No comments? Yeah, Victor?
Yeah, fascinated about craving and grasping. So the goal is not to have craving and grasping towards the end of your.
I mean, I think to some degree, yeah, the question is the goal to not have craving and grasping present at the end of one's life? I think we'll probably still have some subtle form of it, but if we can at least have some craving or grasping towards something that is virtuous and positive, not have it be so caught up in delusion. There's a story, I think His Holiness shares it in the book around this time, where it was a story of a monk who was really attached to his tea, his butter tea in Tibet. And he was having a hard time letting go and actually leaving this life. And so his Lama came to him and said, I've been told they have even more delicious tea in Maitreya's Pure Land. And so he finally let go and was able to, exit this life and go. And His Holiness said it's hard to gauge whether this was a virtuous state of mind or not, because it could have been attachment to the butter tea that he wanted to experience in the Pure Land. But nonetheless, I mean, you want to kind of be free of the deluded aspects of that. Maybe try to have a desire. If we can die with a mind that is virtuous, well then this type of attachment and craving won't be present so much. There'll be a subtle form of it that causes us to still take rebirth. Maybe we won't be quite at the level of a bodhisattva being reborn through compassion, but we'll at least have a compassionate thoughts that are that third factor. That third factor is the big determinant that Geshe Sopa mentioned. The thoughts that we have at the time of death, if you die with bodhicitta in your mind, if you die with strong compassion in your mind, then you're going to have a virtuous karma come forward. That will also be nurtured by some subtle level of craving and grasping, but it won't be the craving and grasping that causes us to plummet into a lower rebirth. Because there's always, this is our default mode, is to have some level of desire. This is why it's called the desire room. We've always got that kind of present. So it's going to be present at the time of death, but if we can at least instill some virtuous thoughts that can nurture a more positive seed that will propel us into a good existence. So, but in the meantime, yeah, work on your craving and grasping, absolutely. It's one of the most difficult things to combat, but nonetheless, we have to have some skill in working with that. That's why in the traditional teachings, again, we talk about coarser ways of working with the afflictions first, because we do have to kind of trim the tree before we uproot it. The uprooting is done when we get rid of all the ignorance, but trimming the tree means we have to at least have a little less desire and craziness in our lives. That's why often the first line of defense is stop going to all those objects that induce more desire, more craving in our lives. Stop that force that compels us to continually be seeking those things in our lives, simplifying our life, making our life where we're content with whatever it is that we have. I mean, it's much better to live your life that way anyway. But then, to get rid of these afflictions of craving and grasping once and for all, you have to get rid of ignorance. You have to uproot the whole tree. But it's very hard to uproot the tree when all the branches are all fully grown and totally operative. You need to have something that's a little bit easier to uproot. And so there's great benefit to working with craving and grasping and offsetting them in one's life as much as possible. So, any other comments or questions? Thank you for that. Okay, so let's go ahead. We just have like 3 minutes or something, but I think we can finish off these. Let's go to verse 26, 8th verse of that, and look at the second line there, line B. Let me see if I can find my verses again. I took them out of their folder for their thing here. Okay, and from becoming emerges birth. So this is just a simple statement that when you have that fully potentialized seed of karma that you created, birth will ensue. You will have birth from that. Again, you go through an intermediate state and link up with the aggregates of the next lifetime. But birth here, as it says on your chart, refers to the point of conception, not the emergence from the womb. So we're not talking about birth in terms of when the baby comes out of the womb of the mother. We're talking about, or when the chicken comes out of the egg or whatever. We're talking about conception, when that life has begun, because consciousness joins up at that point. So that's that moment. Everything that follows after that is aging. Let's go to the lines that have to do with aging and death, the last two of verse 8 and then the rest of all of verse 9. Aging, death, and sorrow, grief, suffering, and so on, as well as unhappiness and agitation, these come from birth. What comes into being is only a mass of suffering. So essentially, aging starts the very next moment after birth. In a subtle way, we can talk about that aging, as it says there on our chart. One type of aging begins from the moment of conception, and the other begins with what we call physical deterioration or old age, when age is felt in a more suffering way. Death is the end of the lifetime that was actualized by the 10th link and commenced with the 11th link. So when you were born into that life, by virtue of that birth, you will die. I mean, it is just a natural law of what is born will die. You know, all beings go through that process. By the way, when he talks about birth, His Holiness does mention birth by womb, from an egg, what's called spontaneous birth, which happens in the hell realms. If you are born into the hell realms or into the form realms and so on, you take birth there right after the intermediate state, fully formed. You don't have any kind of birth. There are no hell mothers with giving birth to hell babies and what have you. You know. So, but there are, you know, womb existences, of course, in this world as well as some of the other realms. Then the fourth one that is mentioned is birth from moisture. And His Holiness says this also requires some examination. And I think it's perhaps because people who observed that there would be a place where there's moisture and suddenly you'd see little critters growing there and you'd think that they were coming from the moisture, but they're actually coming from the eggs that are planted by the, or left behind by the beings, the insects and what have you that are in that water, and that they come arising from those eggs. So it's whether there is something that's called birth from moisture in the human realm or in this world that we live in, I don't think so. But nonetheless, you know, who knows what realms of existence there are. His Holiness didn't go into it in any more detail. But essentially, this is what we're talking about. Of course, he elaborates, Nagarjuna elaborates in terms of what we mean by just simply that phrase, aging and death, to show all of what ensues, all the sorrow, the grief, the suffering, the unhappiness, the agitation, all of these come from birth. And what comes into being is only a mass of suffering. Again, as we saw when we look at the Four Noble Truths. The very first truth saying, this is dukkha, this is unsatisfactory, this is suffering. Every moment of this existence is suffering because it's the third type of suffering, the pervasive condition suffering. As long as we are under the control of these factors, we're in an unsatisfactory state. So all of those aren't included in terms of the statement of aging and death being the 12th link, but they're all implicit within that. As soon as you're born, the aging process begins, and all the various other things that you experience in samsara, which are all conditioned in the same way, under the control of your karma and your delusions. And until you break free of it, if you die without having addressed the first link, then the whole process, of course, begins again. You keep creating new karmas through the force of your ignorance, and the whole process is set in motion. So this is the whole idea that they do make a circle. If you die without having addressed ignorance, another moment of ignorance arises. Another action arises. It gets imprinted on the consciousness. Eventually, you know, all the factors come into place that cause it to induce another rebirth. So next week, what we'll do is we'll look at how those play out in terms of 2 or 3 lifetimes, just so you have that information if you haven't seen that before. And then also maybe a little bit of more discussion on these. But we're definitely going to go into the last part of this, which talks about the reversal process. You know, how do we actually undo this? And that's where we then will move into the 18th chapter, which teaches us the emptiness of the self of persons, which is the main realization that we have to actualize in order to accomplish that. All right, let's go ahead and do the dedication prayers. Oh, wow. We have some symbols coming from somewhere.
I have no idea what's behind it.
Okay. Well, we can do the prayers with those wonderful auspicious symbols. Go to page 235, and let's do the first 2 verses there. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then go to page 244, and there'll be again that, for those of you here in the Gampa, there's the new prayer for His Holiness's long life and wishes that Rinpoche is advising us to do. We've got that paper clip to the next page. We'll do that together in English, and then we'll go back to 244 and do the verse for Rinpoche. As we're reciting these again, think that we're creating the causes for all of our spiritual guides, all guides that are helping sentient beings to have good health and long lives, and for all of us to never be parted from perfect guides in all our lifetimes. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally dedicate for anyone you're holding in your heart. Whatever their suffering might be, send this positive energy out to them so that it becomes the cause to immediately relieve their suffering and to bring them all the opportune conditions for them to find true peace and happiness. And may all beings find complete happiness through what we have done here tonight. Okay, thank you all so much. Thank you everyone online.